We thank Luna for the offertory. Good morning. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott-Huffman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm excited to see all of your beautiful faces in this space this morning. So give yourself a pat on the back. With all the complexity that is bound up in it for this community with roots in multiple religious traditions and centuries of secular practices as well, I wish you this morning a happy Easter, along with Pesach Sameach, happy Passover, thank you, and Ramadan Mubarak, blessed Ramadan. As a group of people whose beliefs and or practice draw from a diverse set of religious and non-religious sources, it seems important to note that this weekend, the major holidays of these three monotheistic Abrahamic faiths converge and have about 4.5 billion people, or about 57% of the world's population, observing their sacred days at the same time. Because the three faiths use different calendars and different formulae to determine the date of the feast or the fast, the convergence of these holy days only happens about every 30 years. Religious leaders in all three traditions are using this rare moment of intersection as an opportunity to speak out in favor of unity, peace, and collaboration for a greater common good. And as one who advocates for interfaith education and cooperation, I'm excited about this convergence for lots of reasons, but largely because it provides an obvious opportunity for people of different religious traditions to learn more about each other and to gain appreciative knowledge of traditions other than their own. You may or may not know that science has shown that a person gaining appreciative knowledge of a practice or belief of one person who they view as different from them opens them up to appreciative knowledge from everyone who holds that different belief. And further, that our appreciative knowledge of people who hold one different belief than us opens us up to learning and having appreciative knowledge about all people who are different from us. You may or may not know that I identify theologically and religiously as a Unitarian Universalist Christian. I am really thankful to have those words these days and to be a part of this community, even if most of you would likely identify as another brand of UU, whether that be Buddhist or pagan, or humanist, or some worldview that defies labels, certainly atheist and agnostic, Wiccan, all the ways that we show up in this space, you are welcome to identify as a UU whatever. And so I stand here today as a UU Christian, and we'll talk a little bit about Easter, the holiday that we celebrate in that tradition today. I used to think that I was just a Christian who was sort of odd, because I thought the doctrine of the Trinity was kind of a load of crap. And I struggled with some other things that were particularly Christian. I felt that there was something wrong with the idea that some people were saved, whatever that meant, and that some people weren't. And so my unwillingness to subscribe to the doctrine of the Trinity, I guess, makes me a Unitarian. And my disbelief of salvation for some people and not others apparently makes me a Universalist. So here I am. And here you are.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Truth be told, even in just Christian circles, I wasn't actually an odd one out. There were actually droves of them. I just hadn't found my people. The ones who don't read the Bible literally and don't make apologies for it, who understand the teachings of Jesus to be fundamentally about inclusion rather than exclusion. And since we're talking about Easter today, who don't need a literal empty tomb or bodily resurrection of Jesus to know that something really important happened to a community that gets celebrated on Easter. So if we're going to talk about Easter, we should read some of the story connected to the tradition. Let me start with the story from the Christian Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, which describes the scene after the crucifixion death of Jesus on the cross of Rome. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could go and anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they came to the tomb. They were saying to each other, "Who's going to roll away the stone from the entrance for us?" And when they looked up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, and it was a very large stone. Going into the tomb, they saw a young man in a white robe seated on the right side, and they were startled. But he said to them, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He isn't here. Look, here's the place where they laid him. Go, tell his disciples, especially Peter, that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you." Overcome with terror and dread, they fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This is how the first gospel told the story of the resurrection of Jesus. The gospel that we call Mark was written somewhere between 66 and 70 of the Common Era, so not an eyewitness account by any means, since we think Jesus died somewhere around the year 30, much to the chagrin of those who claim to know with absolute certainty that it was 3 p.m. on April 3rd in the year 33 AD. They wouldn't use the distinguished Common Era designation to identify that time either. Date arguments notwithstanding, the real point that I want to make is that apart from the Apostle Paul's reference to the resurrection in 1 Corinthians, written about 53 of the Common Era, this account in Mark is the first attempt at creating a narrative around both the timeline of Jesus' death in relation to his ministry and the idea of resurrection, and beginning to make some theological sense of it. And quite frankly, it falls flat. Overcome with terror and dread, they fled the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Well, I guess that's the end of that. Thankfully, at least for the future of Christianity, more writers came along that we call Matthew and Luke and John, and they told a better story. They told stories, actually, not just one story, that included powerful post-resurrection visitations by Jesus to his closest followers and those who would carry on his mission after his death. And it seems that sometime around the 2nd century, an additional ending was added to Mark. Somebody fixed it. An ending that was lengthened even further in later years, scholars believe, until the final canonical form of Mark chapter 16 is twice as long as it started. I say all of this to say that the idea of Jesus' resurrection and the ways that it was understood to impact his followers is a tradition that developed over time and in community. The traditions that develop around resurrection and the meanings assigned to it are many and diverse, and always have been. It's the reason that Paul is arguing about the meaning of resurrection in his first letters that he writes to his churches, just 2 decades after the death of Jesus. And people have been arguing about it ever since, as people do when they're passionate about something. I feel like as UUs, we can appreciate that practice. I am inclined to agree with the Jesus Seminar scholar Marcus Ford when he says, the risen Jesus is not a physical bodily reality. The resurrection stories from the New Testament make that clear. The risen Jesus appears in a locked room. He journeys with 2 of his followers for a couple of hours and is not recognized. And when he is recognized, he vanishes. He appears in both Jerusalem and Galilee at the same time. He appears to Stephen in his dying moments. He appears to Paul in or on the road to Damascus as a brilliant light. He appears to the author of Revelation on an island off the coast of Turkey in the late 90s of the 1st century. These texts are not about Jesus being restored to his previous life as a physical being. If such events happen, they are resuscitations. Resuscitated persons resume the finite physical life they had before and will die again someday. Whatever affirming the resurrection of Jesus means, it does not mean this. He goes on to say, the central meaning of Easter is not about whether something happened to the corpse of Jesus. Its central meanings are that Jesus continues to be known and that he is Lord to his followers, over against the assertions of lordship by the rulers of the empire. Borg writes, the tomb could not hold him. He's loose in the world. In other words, the mission and ministry of Jesus lives on in those who pick up the mantle, and in this renewed and expanded life, the commitment to the mission is held by many and not just one, so it spreads rapidly. I suspect that if they had left it with Mark's original ending, that the tradition hadn't developed a fuller and more inspiring story, the Jesus movement might have died with its leader. A fair number of you were thinking, well, that wouldn't have been bad. But we also have to recognize that if that movement had died, we wouldn't be gathered here either. Because that movement is our roots. Without the Jesus movement becoming Christianity, and without the development of a bogus or at least incomplete doctrine of the Trinity, and without a bunch of wise people pushing back against Trinitarianism to form Unitarianism, and without the doctrines of salvation by faith alone, or salvation by faith and works together, or whatever way countless theologians, both educated and armchair, have conceived of salvation, and without, again, a bunch of enlightened people pushing back against the idea that some are saved and some are not, and instead insisting on universalism, and without the developments in the UU history that caused us to broaden our theological horizons to include many diverse paths to spiritual vitality, I wouldn't be standing here today in my bow tie that I tied 4 times. I wouldn't be talking to you, a diverse group of spiritual and ethical seekers who are vastly and beautifully connected to divergent religious and non-religious worldviews on this day that our Christian cousins celebrate resurrection. And we too celebrate new vitality in so many ways. A mid-1980s Chicago Tribune article notes that Easter is the most sacred festival of the Christian calendar, and it is a day of special complexity for the Unitarian Universalist Association, which traces some of its early roots to European Christianity, but has long since abandoned most of the fundamentals of the faith, including belief in the physical resurrection of Jesus. But one doesn't need a belief in physical resurrection to appreciate the universal themes of Easter, which are new life and hopeful, even stubborn, cycles of death and rebirth. I believe in resurrection. Not necessarily in the bodily resuscitation of Jesus or of us after we are dead, but certainly in the revitalization or revival of something. And specifically the revitalization of our own power to bring about change and renewal, and in the power of our legacies to be a catalyst for transformation. The story of the resurrection of Jesus is fundamentally a story of refusal to concede victory to a violent and destructive empire that was being propped up by puppet rulers who had tragically confused their religious convictions and their easily exploitable desire for self-preservation and self-promotion. People who refuse to believe that violence and extremism will have the last word, people who choose constant reminders of our own mortality to the hopeful truth of new life that takes shape in ways that we just don't understand, people who refuse to get stuck in those spaces and continue to look for the new life that will happen after the death that we experience in so many ways in our life. These people are not stupid or naive or gullible. They are resolute in their insistence that things can and should be better, and that they have a part in making it so. And so I wonder about the power of a community believing so deeply in a hopeful story, a story that flies in the face of grave injustice and deep despair, that it changes their lived reality, changes the way they live in community together, and changes the trajectory not just of their own future, but of generations and geographies that they haven't even imagined. Granted, as we know, there have been tragic misunderstandings and abuses along the way. There is always that danger. We can't gloss over that, but we also can't deny that much good has been done as well. But what I'm really interested in now is us, in our hopeful story, and the way that it lives on beyond us. When I see all of these children gathered in this sanctuary today, I see already the way that the story of hope in this congregation lives on beyond us. That the principles that we shared here this morning grow in those children, and that they become the adults who live them out in their everyday lives and spread justice and peace and love in the world around them. Think about the kind of power that we hold to form ourselves as a community around a powerful story, or say, a set of principles, and devote ourselves so fully to our living of them that we might change the trajectory of our world from this point forward. As we honor and celebrate the overlapping religious holidays in 3 major world religions today, we see our multi-faith friends observing sacred rituals that remember and hope for liberation, for resurrection, and for self-sacrifice for the purpose of serving others. May we be inspired by their faith and commitment. May we lean into this rare moment of convergence to dream together of a more peaceful and just future where the best of our religious values bring us together to do good instead of the worst of them tearing us apart. And may we connect with our own powerful story that challenges our minds, warms our hearts, and propels our hands to love and serve the world. May it be so. Blessed be. And amen.